and you're joining me for day 5 of my e-bike touring adventure of northern Spain. I've just spent 2 days crossing the plains between Burgos and Leon, but today we're going back up into the mountains. We're heading for Ponferrada. It's about 107 kilometers of cycling, but we're climbing up to 1500 meters above sea level. As you'll see, some of the roads we're cycling on are really rough. There's dirt tracks. It's a bit of a challenge today, but let's have a look at this in more detail. The distance I was covering meant I set off from the early morning in Leon, just before rush hour really got underway. I'd managed to find a cafe to eat in. The trick is, if you're in the tourist district, cross the road to the shopping district, where cafes are far cheaper, and some of them open as early as 7:30. I think I paid about £2 for a coffee and a tortilla. After that, you're on a long cycle to get out of the city itself. It is the disadvantage of deciding to stay in some of the big cities while you're touring, because it does mean you'll have about 10 kilometers of high traffic streets on the way into the city, and then maybe the same coming out. Now, Spain, in my experience, is pretty good for having cycleways laid out and alternative routes, and using cycle travel, so that's the map I have pulled up there earlier. It's also very good at plotting you ways out that are less traffic inclined. I do feel sorry for the Camino walkers, because this 10 kilometers or so I covered in maybe half an hour, maybe slightly more, whereas if you were walking it, you'd probably be walking for 2 to 3 hours, and not so interesting. As we get further out, you will start to notice Camino walkers at the side of my footage here. Anyway, about 10 kilometers out, you get out near the airport, and then you're turning onto some quieter roads. You're crossing the motorway, and you're going to be getting out back into the countryside. Now, I didn't know quite what to expect from today. The cycle travel map had indicated there was going to be a fair amount of off-road, and I didn't know how rough that was going to be. I knew from my experience the previous 4 days that some of the tracks in Spain are very rough, and I don't have a gravel bike. I have 28mm tyres, so really rough going tends to slow me down. But initially, at least, it's a fairly good main road out of the city. You come into this final kind of suburban town, and then here we are on the rough track itself. Day 5 is this, and I've just left Leon. It takes 11 kilometers before you get out of the city, so I'd say if you're walking the Camino, I'd get a taxi or a bus and skip that, because it's industrial estates and housing estates and stuff, not much fun. But now I have reached a dirt track that I think goes for about 10 kilometers. The surface was quite rough coming on it. It's got water-filled potholes, but it's not as bad as some of the other ones I've faced so far. So hopefully this doesn't take me hours to cross. The first 50 kilometres or so of today's cycle to the city of Astorga are much like the previous 2.5 days. That's pretty flat cycling on plains, but a lot of it on these very rough roads. And once we get to Astorga, things are going to change drastically, because it's a climb for almost another 50 kilometres from there to the pass. But this bit was quite enjoyable, despite the rough tracks and the dodging, because there's a lot of birdsong basically going on here, and you can also smell some of the lavender you can see growing at the side of the tracks. So I wouldn't skip it. You know, you could try and avoid some of this by going on roads, but I do think these Camino tracks are worth experiencing in themselves. On this section we're cycling through at the moment, there's a lot of lagoons and moorlands nearby, which apparently there's been ecological restoration projects on. So the birds, what we're hearing in some of those clips, include bluebirds, tents, a wide range of migratory birds apparently, all of which have returned to the area in some number. As I said, very, very flat, so you can see a very long distance, and if you look to the right there, you can just about get the hint of the mountains that are coming ahead, and as we progress, those are going to get a little bit closer. There's a couple of spots on the route where there are side laneways that you can pull into. I'd recommend doing that and having a look at some of the terrain just off the road. The wildlife and the flowers in particular are quite stunning. There's a lot of pretty scenes just set a little bit back, and sometimes of course you're going to want to take a break, and on these very flat plains finding somewhere to take a break can be a bit of an issue. So sun wise, it was going to be a sunny day. As you can see, the sun is already out, but I'm doing this quite early in the year. We're now in mid-May. So as you'll see from the footage what I video myself, I'm actually wearing a very, very lightweight Gore-Tex rain jacket, which I realised had the handy side effect of giving me a very high SPF and keeping the sun off. Otherwise, I think you definitely want to be lathering yourself in sun cream from quite early on in the morning. I was checking the UV indexes. I was peaking at about 7, but it was already up around 4 or 5 by 10 a.m. and it stayed up around there till about 5 a.m. Hopefully you can hear some of the bird song going on there in the background. It's Monday morning. I'm 25 kilometers out of Leon, and I thought I'd just shoot this to look at how quiet the roads are. I was on Sunday, they were very, very quiet, and I was kind of like, okay, well, I guess that's not surprising. But I think the main reason is that Spanish housing patterns are so different to Ireland, because in Ireland, the countryside, there's bungalows everywhere in the countryside. You know, the roads are lined with them almost in parts. In Spain, everybody lives in the village, and it's very unusual to see a house out in the countryside. So, like I've seen, they tend to be village sort of places, which means that if you're going to the shops, the kids are going to school, you're going to church, you're visiting your relatives. It's probably all happening in the same village, and you're probably not even, or town, you're probably not even driving, you're probably walking. Whereas in Ireland, all those things involve people getting the cars. So I'd imagine if I was on the road at say 8:30, I'd have seen more traffic, people going to work maybe. But yeah, it's amazing. There's just like nothing. Having just watched that clip back myself, I see in fact I'm wearing my fairly heavy black fleece. So that's because although it's sunny and it's in mid-May, we're at about 800 metres above sea level here, so the nights are quite cold. And later on, when I met another cyclist for lunch, we had a bit of a discussion about that. He had been hoping to do some camping, using campsites rather than wild camping, I think mostly, but had discovered that really it was too cold at night to manage that. It was about 4 degrees centigrade, and I must say, yeah, that's pretty cold. I wouldn't really fancy doing that regularly myself. So that's an unexpected factor that might hit you, and you will notice that the Camino walkers here that we're passing are often wearing quite heavy fleeces and jackets themselves. Later on the day, it does warm up. Certainly by 11 to midday, it's getting quite hot, and if anything, you're starting to get a little bit too warm. Villa Vente here provided a handy second breakfast stop at the Albuquerque on the way into town. I think that was about €6 worth of food there, and then setting off. So this area is pretty old and historic. This particular town has a local legend from about the 11th century of two Moors, a man and a woman, who wanted to get married, and they had to divert the river in order for that to be allowed. We'll get to the river now in a few kilometres, and it took many, many years, but finally it happened. So the river is the River Ebike, and that's what we're heading towards. We're following the rail line for a section here before we get to it. This bit of the track is extremely rough. I mean, you can sort of tell from the video, you can see the gravel there yourself. This was slow and hard going. But also offered the traditional contrast at this stage between having a piece of very rough track and getting very fed up with being on that rough track, and then getting onto a relatively busy road and going, God, I kind of wish I was back on the rough track again. You can never quite get that balance perfect. Watch your directions as you're doing this section, because the bit coming up, the main part of the road is going to swing to the left, but actually we're sort of going straight ahead, slightly right to stay on the Camino trail. It's not very well signposted at this particular spot, so this is the bit we're just coming up to here now, in fact, yeah. So go straight ahead, and then you're going to come up onto the main road. I think this is the N120, or at least it feeds onto the N120. That features a whole lot in these videos of these days as we're going around. So I didn't want to keep on the Camino track, it's a bit too narrow, so I popped out here onto the main road and then onto this roundabout. And now that I remember, this is the N120 crossing it, and this is one of the moments at which I got a little bit confused about being on the right side of the road and was looking in the wrong direction. So I got a loud beep crossing here. Anyway, All that aside, we are now getting to the river Orbigo itself. So there's a medieval bridge here that in 1434, I think, was the scene of a very famous challenge by a Spanish aristocrat and 10 of his knights, who said they would fight any knight who tried to cross the bridge, and that they intended to break 300 lances in doing so. So basically had set up this jousting tournament on the bridge that went on for quite a while, until the whole bunch of them got so injured that they had to declare victory and head off. Guy's no particular hero. He was also responsible for an anti-Semitic pogrom in the area, but that's the history of Spain. So we have the Moors, Christians and Jews in this particular setting, and all the history that went with the expulsions in the aftermath of that. We're not far, in fact, from the El Cid Trail, which runs south from Burgos. I think I mentioned that a couple of days ago, and it's one of the things that I'm considering doing in the future. Anyway, back from the history onto some more rough trails. Again, this is pretty bad gravel, plugging through it, but again, it's going to be switching from this point in the journey between this sort of heavy going slow gravel and relatively busy roads for a section. You can always tell the particularly rough sections from this video footage because I zigzag from one side of the track to the other in a desperate search for a slightly more smooth road. There's a sign of an optical illusion that means it always looks like the other side is smooth, and then you go over there and it's not. It's just as bad. Anyway, as you're doing this section, you're coming back up to the main road again, and that at least gives you the option to hop back on the road. In fact, as you'll see, the trail that runs alongside the road itself gets rougher and rougher, so pretty much you're forced onto it. This is our old friend, the N20 a bit, N120 again, and this is a particularly busy section of it. Other parts of the N120 aren't particularly busy, but at least it has a hard shoulder. There's bits of it you can then come off, and the trail is smooth enough because it's a secondary road running alongside it, so it is worth paying a lot of attention to your navigation as you're doing this section. As I've mentioned before, in Spain there is a legal requirement to use side trails where they exist. I took a break here and forgot to set the camera running again afterwards, so we have about 5 kilometers that is missing between the small town of San Justo de la Vega, which was a Visigoth town, so that's about 4th century, the Visigoths were there, and the much larger town of Astorga, which was a Roman town. I stopped in Astorga for lunch, met this fellow cyclist, had a bit of a chat about life on the road. I think this only cost me about €7, by the way, in the city centre, so that was a pretty good deal, and then got going to get out of Astorga. Astorga is a relatively big town. There's quite a lot to see here. Because I was doing such a large distance today, I didn't really have time to have a look around, but there are Roman walls and then later medieval period stuff that might be well worth considering to have a stop at. It's probably quite a good base in terms of food and accommodation options as well, I remember, but then it's back out of town and once again passing some of those Camino walkers. This is the foothills of the mountains, so basically from this point for something like the next 45 kilometers I'm going to be starting a slow climb up towards the pass, and that pass is at about 1500 meters. Initially it doesn't feel like the terrain has changed very much. It still feels very flat. You can still see a good distance on either side of the road. The Camino trail running alongside the road, again, it's pretty rough and narrow, so as there wasn't much traffic on the main road, this was another situation where it really made sense to get back on it. And then as you slowly climb up towards the mountains, the traffic really starts thinning out. There's basically very few cars are using this route at all, except I will suspect a few tourists who are also going up there to have a look. There's a string of old medieval towns as you're going up, all of them quite pretty in themselves, and because this is the Camino trail, almost all of them have albergos. I'm still not sure about the pronunciation of that word. So the pilgrim hostels that do basic meals and cheap accommodation. So as a cyclist, those would probably be quite useful to take advantage of. I wanted the luxury of my own room accommodation in terms of the distances I intended to do, so I didn't really use them myself. But they're quite an option. And in fact, they go all the way up to the pass itself. And that makes sense, because if you're walking the Camino, you're walking up this very, very long route up to the pass. You're probably not necessarily going to be wanting to do massive distances in each day. Particularly if you were trying to do this in summer. I mean, here where it is now the early afternoon, it was really, really quite warm, and it was becoming an increasing struggle to actually keep going up those hills. I'd done a long distance at this stage, and I was definitely getting to the point where I felt I was overheating. I needed to take breaks. This is my lunchtime mate again, meeting him on the road out. And not the only cyclist. I did see a couple more as I was heading up. But as with much of the rest of the Camino routes, touring cyclists were really quite rare in comparison to the number of walkers you saw. You were more inclined to see the occasional sports club run that was out for the day. Not so much on this route till I got up to the other side. And in the descent, and you'll notice in my footage from the descent, there are a few, here's another couple of touring cyclists, there are a few lycra cyclists, for lack of a better word, passing me out. I suspect that's because Ponferrada is actually a really good base for cycling, so people come up to the pass from that side, stop at the top, and then go back down again. Certainly with the touring bike setup and the heavy bags, I did get some odd looks from them, because that was probably, they reckoned quite rightly that it was quite a struggle to get up there. Whether or not they were aware I was on an e-bike, I'm not too sure, but this particular day is definitely a day that's a very, very strong argument for using an e-bike while touring, because this long 40-kilometre climb would be very grueling indeed, particularly in the summer months when things are a lot warmer. At this stage, though, I'm really feeling the accumulated effect of the heat, the distance, and the perhaps a little bit too large lunch I'd had, and the glass of wine, I think, as well. And it's getting pretty tiring, and I need to take a good few breaks. And then I see something that makes me despair a bit. So I just gave myself a huge fright. This is my second day of over 100 kilometres, and this one has a climb up above 1,500 metres, which I'm not quite at the top yet. I think I have 8 kilometres to go, but I looked at my mapping app and it told me I had 54 kilometres to go to my hotel, and I was like, God, I don't think I can do that. So I stopped, got some shade, had a better look at the map, and realised I somehow earlier in the day added a 20-kilometre extension on, so it's 34 kilometres. I think I can do 34. I think it's only 8 kilometres to the top, and I think it's only another 200 metres of climbing, so it's tough, but let's see if I make it. This sort of multi-day cycle touring with quite ambitious distances each day is great if, like me, you suffer a bit from anxiety. As I've mentioned in the other videos, it's not an unusual experience for me to set off in the morning and being a bit anxious about everything that can go wrong. So it's actually quite useful to have situations where you feel very, very challenged and you are forced to go through them. There isn't really an option. I mean, you could always try and ring a taxi or something, but you're forced to keep going on. You push through them, you make it, and then you feel much more better about how you can deal with things in future. And here we are, nearly at the top of the climb. A little bit further to go, but I think we are now with about 3 kilometres to go. It's become quite steep, but it's the final bit. I'm completely exhausted, but I'm going, okay, once I push it another couple of kilometres, I'll be at the top, and then it'll be downhill. That wasn't quite accurate, as it turned out. I had forgotten one particular detail of this climb, and I'll mention that in a minute. But here we are, getting up to the final small town, which also has a couple of hostels in it, by the way, just underneath the ridge. There's another 100 metres of climb to go from here to the course that marks the actual top of the pass. And you always know you're getting near the top because suddenly the other side of the road also has a view. So now we reach the top of the pass, where we'll find the Cruz de Ferro, the Iron Cross. Here it is here, which is in fact the highest point on the entire Camino Francis. And that pile is stones that people have brought from their homes and deposited by the cross, according to tradition. Apparently some sort of cross has been there since the 11th century, but it's also speculated that there may well have been a cairn there going back to at least Celtic times, and a tradition basically of putting cairns to mark routes, and then as things became Christianized later on, crosses were often added to them. There's quite a few points on my cycle from Burgos that I noted cairns with crosses on them on the route, but also much smaller than this. And here's what I mentioned earlier. That was the top, and then there's a dip, and then there's another climb that goes almost as high again, and because it catches you by surprise is a bit of a stinker, because you're going, oh no, not again. But when you get up to the very top here and you round this mountain, you have a great view into the distance with snowy mountains far away, and then you have the descent. Now this is where I had stopped to put on my jacket again, because the descent was going to be cold. And if you look, you'll see in the distance you can see rain falling, and in fact from this very top point you can see a long way. And I was wondering if the final stage of this cycle was going to be yet another day where I was going to be drenched reaching my hotel. The thing that does surprise you on the way down is that suddenly this road turns into a really narrow village street, really narrow and bumpy. I guess there's no room to build a bypass around it, so all the traffic ends up going through this, but certainly quite a welcome surprise and a break. Now that's the point that I think a lot of cyclists coming up from Ponferrada stop at and turn around, because it's from this point on that I start to see lycra cyclists on the road, people who are out for a day trip and have gone up to the pass and on the way back down, and either passing me, coming up past me, or overtaking me indeed on the way down in a quite impressive. I wonder what speed they're doing, because I'm already going very fast. This is a long set of bends, and periods of quite tight S-bends. This one coming up here, for instance, that goes a long way down until you reach another small pretty town with yet another medieval bridge. We'll be getting to that in a moment. I took a couple of breaks on the way down, basically because of adrenaline. With that particular break enabling me to catch the cowbell sound that I'd failed to do on the other ones. A second one on a very tight S-bend video. And now we're on the final descent down into the village of Molinesca, which has the reputation, in fact, as the most beautiful of the villages on the route. I didn't stop for very long. I was on my way through, but this basically has been here probably since Roman times. We are now very near the vast Roman gold mines at Los Medulas. I'm going to be there in 2 days' time, so keep following the videos and you'll get to those as well. But a brief stop here, and then across the original Roman bridge, they say, which is of course also the Camino route itself, and then down through another one of these tiny narrow village streets, probably about the 5th or 6th I'd seen at this particular point in time. And then you're onto the main road, and it's a short and almost all downhill run to Ponferrada itself. This, by the way, is the old Roman road, well, pretty much on the route of the old Roman road that the gold was extracted from. In fact, pretty much since we've left Astorga, we've been following that route, at least roughly. The Romans were taking the huge gold mines from Los Medulas and then transporting up this road. And so we reached the town of Ponferrada. It's the biggest town for quite a distance on this route. I think a population of about 65,000. I stayed in what's called the New Town, which is where a lot of the tourist accommodation is. My hotel was the Hostel Rio Selma, I think, which was actually very good value and did have a place to park bikes. Basically, there's a bike rack and charging points, in fact, which is pretty impressive, just inside the door where the dining room is for the morning. So definitely worth considering for only €40. And then I walked up to the historic city, which is a little bit above in the hill, where there's a temple, a castle, and got myself a substantial meal, and set myself up for the next day. So this brings us to the end of the 5th day of my 23-day tour of Spain. Follow the channel to get future updates and the further videos on a day-by-day basis. Do give this video a thumbs up. That's going to help it to get out to more people. If you want to follow me in future live from the road, follow my Instagram account. That's also called Ebike Touring Life. And basically, when I'm actually on the road, I'm not doing these YouTube videos. It takes far too much time. What I'm doing is I'm posting still photographs and videos onto that Instagram account, and then each day I tend to do a little short write-up of what my experiences have been. So if you want to know what I'm doing right now, just go over there, have a look, and you'll have an idea. Hopefully this is all encouraging you to consider cycle touring and e-bike touring in particular as a good way of seeing the world, and if so, maybe one day I'll meet you on the road.